Welcome, everyone. Today is Sabbath, May 14th, 2022. And today we're going to continue the study that we began, excuse me, a few weeks ago during the Passover unleavened bread season, when we began to talk about what's called the Great Reset. And this will be part two, and more than likely the final part. Now, I will do sort of a review because it's been a few weeks since we cover it, but obviously I won't go into the kind of detail that I did way back when. So I have a lot of material to show you with regard to the Great Reset, and I'm going to use an article, a specific article, and literally go through that entire article with you, and that will be the foundation of the study, and my comments will be inserted along the way as I give you sort of a running commentary on that article. As a matter of fact, I'll be reading from several sources today, and I'll point out what those sources are as we come to them. Whenever we talk about things like this, it's important to understand that you want to have reliable sources and credible sources, because people sometimes don't appreciate what you're saying, or they don't believe what you're saying, and you want to be able to have that information so that you could speak with a degree of credibility. Now, as I did when I first began to talk about the Great Reset, let me just preface the study with a few remarks. Okay, so it's important to understand that and you all, most of you here, if not all of you, have attended things with me for a long time now, and you know the kind of person that I am. You know that I'm not a person given to capricious information. I'm not given to conspiracy theories and things of that nature. Okay, so as I start speaking about these things, some of it's going to sound a little strange, right? And I want to emphasize that what I'm speaking about today is not conspiracy theory. Okay, it's world events that are happening right now, right this very second. Okay, and have been for some time. But what happens is, as we start going through some of this material, like everything else, there are individuals out there who will take some of the facts on the ground, and they will weave them into a story that will make it seem conspiracy theorists-like. And I think that we, especially as believers in Yahweh, I think we have to be extremely careful not to fall into those kind of things. So, and that goes not just with this material, but with anything. People they revel in talking about prophetic texts, and a lot of times people, in their zeal to kind of talk about those things, they tend to see a fulfillment of prophecy in every corner. I'm not one of those people. Okay, and over the years, I've learned the dangers of broad brushing too much and of making assumptions in a way that can get you into trouble in terms of your long-term credibility. So I want to emphasize that, as I have said to you in the past, one of my goals with Teaching Hope Ministries, in addition to teaching hope and to keeping you aware and keeping you informed, is to get us, all of our participants, to get us to think about things in a mature way, right? I don't want us to be like reactionary religious people out there, that they'll see something, and the mere appearance of that thing looking like something in the Bible, all of a sudden you grab that and then you run with it. Because a lot of times what you wind up doing is you don't look at all the facts, you don't see that through to the end, and then you wind up having egg on your face and you look silly, you look foolish, and that does not help our cause, right? So what we want to do is we want to look at the things that are out there and glean what we can from them, but to do that in a responsible way and in a mature way, okay? Because in that way we still remain informed, but we don't spout things that are half-baked and that are loony and that make us look like we don't know what we're talking about, right? Now, there are going to be people, and this I will say as well, there are going to be people that will take even the facts and they will twist them and they will lie and they will try to make it look like something else. Why? Because people have an agenda, okay? And that we have to recognize as well. But to the extent that we can avoid playing into the hands of individuals who will throw things back in our face in that manner, because we do things in a responsible and mature way, I want us to do everything possible to be able to do that, okay? So I'm giving you all that preface because I think that the material that we're going to cover is going to seem really, really just very strange. Okay. And if you sat through the first part, you understand why I say that. Okay. So anyway, enough of that. So let's just go straight into it. So the main article that I'm going to use for as the backbone of this talk comes from an individual by the name of Michael Rectenwald. And I'm going to actually start that article from the beginning, but I'm not going to, the stuff I've already covered, I'm going to go pretty quickly through it. Okay. But Michael Rectenwald is the chief academic officer for a group called American Scholars. And he has several degrees and a PhD in literary and cultural studies from Carnegie Mellon University. He's taught at New York University, Duke University, North Carolina Central University, Carnegie Mellon University, and Case Western Reserve University. Michael Rectenwald, as I explained to you when we first began, is one of the things that recently occurred with him is that he wound up being pushed out of New York University because of his opposition to the political wokeness that was occurring in that university, like in universities throughout the country. And he resisted it. And because he resisted it, they started making life very difficult for him. So he started pushing back. And eventually they had a negotiated settlement. And then he was, because he had tenure, and he was able to leave. And he's been quite outspoken since. And he's been doing speeches, etc. And one of the speeches that he did was the one that this article is based on. And he did it in a place called Hillsdale College. And he did that in November of 2021. And Hillsdale College is a very conservative university in Michigan, and they've been around for quite some time. And they have a series of conferences. And one of the conferences that they had recently in November of 2021 was specifically on the Great Reset. So what is the Great Reset? Let me just start there before we even get into the article. Well, the Great Reset is an initiative, okay? It's an initiative, it's a project, it's a system of thought that is being championed by a group called the World Economic Forum, okay? The World Economic Forum is an international group. It's sort of a think tank. If you know the term think tank, we have things in the United States like the Brookings Institution or the Heritage Foundation or the Claremont Institute and a whole host of other things, other places where you essentially get together academics and scholars and researchers, the Hoover Institute, and they typically are oriented in a certain direction politically, whether conservative or liberal or libertarian. And the individuals that they attract tend to lean in those directions politically, and they will do research on all of the major types of issues of the day that you see typically in the news in the day-to-day, and they come up with research papers, white papers, and articles, and all kinds of studies and things, and it's what helps inform the discussion in the day-to-day. So the kind of people that you see on panels on CNN and Fox News and MSNBC and all these other places, they're filled with people who are either part of those think tanks or are being influenced by the kind of information that comes out of these various think tanks. So the WEF is really not a think tank per se, but it's more of an international body, not to the degree of something like a UN per se, because it's not a governmental body, but it consists of individuals from all walks of life. It's well, I don't want to say all walks, but it's governmental people who are involved in government, individuals who are involved in business, individuals who are involved in what are called NGOs, non-governmental organizations. It's a whole host of people, all of whom are working towards common goals, okay? And I want to first start, not with the article per se, but I want to start with the website for the WEF. And I want to show you a little bit more about what they're about, because it's central to understanding this talk today. All right, so the World Economic Forum, and I'll just read you straight in from the About Us section. is the International Organization for Public-Private Cooperation. That term, public-private cooperation, is important to understand because what it refers to is public, the public sector, which is government, and private, the private sector, which is business, essentially, corporations. So there is a partnership between governments and businesses, and that's quite crucial to understand simply because these are the major players in the Great Reset. Okay, so just keep that in mind, this idea of public-private cooperation. The forum engages the foremost political, business, cultural, and other leaders of society to shape global, regional, and industry agendas. It was established in 1971. And in 1971, it started out as something called the European Management something or other, and is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. So they typically have their annual meeting in a place called Davos in Switzerland. And so sometimes you'll read an article in the news and they talk about this meeting at Davos. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about this annual meeting of the World Economic Forum, or WEF for short. It was established in 1971 as a not-for-profit foundation and is headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. It is independent, impartial, and not tied to any special interests. Well, that's not exactly true, but it's tied to a lot of different interests. So the forum strives in all its efforts to demonstrate entrepreneurship in the global public interest while upholding the highest standards of governance. Moral and intellectual integrity is at the heart of everything it does. And again, that's according to their different definition of moral and intellectual integrity. Our activities are shaped by a unique institutional culture founded on the stakeholder theory. And I want you to really note that, okay? This concept of the stakeholder theory, because that's extremely important, which asserts that an organization, so if you're looking at terms that are going to be important and that are going to come up again and again in this study, it's going to be this term public-private cooperation in different forms and this concept of stakeholder theory, okay? Stakeholder theory, which is what? Which asserts that an organization is accountable to all parts of society. The institution carefully blends and balances the best of many kinds of organizations from both the public and private sectors, international organizations, and academic institutions. We believe that progress happens by bringing together people from all walks of life who have the drive and the influence to make positive change. And then they have all kinds of forums you see here about us. The Davos Manifesto, that's what they believe in. Things with strategic intelligence and sustainability, that's an important term, just keep it in mind. Leadership and governance, also important, right? Partners, etc. And you can go, this is their website. You can go to their website right now, and all this is out there freely for you to see, okay? All right, so let me stop there for just a minute. So one of the things that I want also as a thread to go through all this, as you hear me out, is that when it comes to the things that are going on here, it's not like, and this is, I think, what distinguishes us doing things responsibly and from a mature point of view as compared to people who want to push conspiracy theories and the like. This is not like people get together behind closed doors in Davos and they smack their hands together and, you know, we're gonna conquer the world, right? That's not how this works, right? That's like the people who look at the devil and they're looking for, you know, the guy with the red suit and the horns and the pitchfork, right? That's not how it happens, right? It's like, what does the scripture say? The scripture says that the adversary presents himself as an angel of light. And what you will often find, more often than not, as a thread throughout scripture, is that the things that happen in terms of everything up to and including, you know, with all world powers, whether it's Pharaoh, Assyria, Babylon, right? And then onward into modern history, going into the present, the things that happen out there that are spoken of by the scriptures and that are spoken about in prophetic trends, which is what we're examining, prophetic trends, right? Not looking at specific prophecies and saying, hey, that's this, and hey, that's this, but more the trends so that we can recognize, we can see the inkling of what's happening. When you're looking at all that, what you're seeing is you're seeing like reflections. It happens with counterfeits, right? It almost always looks like the real thing. So when you look at something like the anti-Messiah, my friends, is not going to come with, with the horns and the pitchfork. The anti-Messiah is going to come looking like a government of peace, right? It's going to come looking like some. I don't believe it's so much as a someone as it is a greater entity, maybe represented by a someone, but that remains to be seen. But whether it's the someone or the whole entity that represents the beast when it arrives on scene, if it isn't here already, right? We don't know. But when it arrives, when it comes there, it's not going to be something that's outlandish. It's going to look like those who are seeking peace. Why do I say that? Because we're told that in the scriptures. When you look at the language, for example, in Revelation, we read these last time. We're not going to do that right now. But in Revelation 6, where it talks about the seals that are broken and the horsemen, the four horsemen, it talks about the first horseman coming on a white horse, and that white horse, people look at that and they say, "Oh, that's the Messiah." It's not, because the personage that's riding that white horse has a bow. The Messiah doesn't. That's not the weapon of choice. The Messiah's weapon is what you see over in Revelation 19. And Revelation 19, he's got the sword, right? The sword of the word. You see that also in the book of Hebrews, that the word of Yahweh is described as a sword, the double-edged sword. He doesn't come with the bow. The bow is carried by Nimrod. That's what you see over in Genesis 10. Nimrod is the symbolic representative of Babylon. Babylon is the counterfeit to Yahweh's will, right? It always has been. So when you look at the book of Daniel, what is the beast? What is the statue that representative of? The head of the statue is representative of a Babylonish way of thinking, which is very similar to the biblical way of thinking. But there are telltale signs that make it different because it's a counterfeit. When you look at a counterfeit bill, my understanding is that it looks pretty much like the real thing. And only someone with really specialized knowledge, who's really trained in it, can look at that and tell the difference between the real thing and counterfeit. If it looked like Monopoly money, it would be easy, right? You could just throw the thing out and say, yeah, this is garbage. But it doesn't. It looks like the real thing. And that's what makes it so difficult to catch. And that's the way it is with religion as well. That's the way it is with government. That's the way it is with global systems. It looks like the real thing. Because it doesn't happen with people, like I said, behind closed doors, right? And with the evil villain, right? The caricatures that you see in cartoons and all that. That's not how it happens. It happens with people who are not tuned into the word of Yahweh, who think that they're doing the right thing. Now, are there some people who are unscrupulous, who are going to try to pass an evil agenda or go through an evil agenda? I'm sure they're mixed into the crowd. But like everything else in life, it just isn't that simple, is it? What happens is you have a lot of people who are divorced from the biblical way of thinking because they think with the head of Babylon, not with the head of Messiah. They think as part of the statue, as part of the body of Babylon, not as part of the body of Messiah. So their thought processes are geared towards secular ways of doing things. They're not geared towards spiritual ways of doing things. And therefore, they're doing things in a humanistic sense. Remember, we talked about numerology in the past. In numerology, the number 7 is the number that Yahweh consistently stamps throughout the scriptures, whether it's the 7th-day Sabbath or the 7 major feasts of Yahweh, or the 7 years that lead to the sabbatical year, and on we can go. The number 7 is stamped everywhere because it's a number that represents a cycle of perfection. When you have one short of that, you have the number 6. And the number 6 is a number that consistently throughout the scriptures in biblical numerology, and most scholars are agreed on this, it has to do with something dealing with humankind, with mankind. In other words, the way I translate that is in the sense of something that is secular, because it is one short. It's one short of Yahweh's perfection of 7. It's close, and it's interesting because man was created on what day? On the 6th day, right? And on the 7th day, Yahweh rested. And that rest has connotations that are beyond. It's not rest in the sense of, oh, I'm tired, I got to rest. It's he sits on his throne. That's what the connotation is, that at the end of 6 days, on the seventh day, Yahweh looks and he sees everything is complete. And now he comes and he sits and he rests on his throne. And the implication is that he's resting, governing everything and watching over everything, you see. Okay. But man, he falls short on the 6th day. He's close, but he's not quite there. He's certainly not there without Yahweh. He needs Yahweh to complete the cycle, you see. So when you look in the scriptures and you see the number 6 and all the derivatives of the number 6, you're going to see that there are connotations having to do with man's insufficiency. So when you look at the book of Revelation, you see the number 666. So is it 666 or is it 666? Either interpretation is possible, and either one of them would lend itself to this concept here. As a matter of fact, when you look throughout biblical numerology and you look at different scriptural passages, you see that the number 600 oftentimes refers to instances of warfare, like 600 chariots in the time of Solomon. There are other instances where, what's his name? Well, I'd have to go look them up. But the number 600, it has a connotation dealing with war, which is typically man's way of ultimately resolving everything, right? With violence, not with the way of Yahweh. The number 60 tends to have to do with nationalism, with a national pride. So if you look at the size of the statue in Book of Daniel, I think it was 60 cubits or something like that. And then the number 6, of course, you see it everywhere as a number dealing with man. So 666, it's like whatever that beast number is and what it represents, and there's a whole lot that goes into that I don't have time to go into right now, but whatever it is, it speaks to man's incompleteness without Almighty Yahweh. So to get back to the way that governments and and corporations and non-governmental organizations and others do things, they do things with an insufficiency because they don't ultimately have Yahweh's plan in mind. They have a secular way of doing things. So the Great Reset, being a system that of a secular system of a group of people trying to implement a better world, so to speak. It's not that there's necessarily a nefarious intent behind that, okay? In other words, it's not an evil plan to go and do all this thing necessarily. There are people in there, I'm sure, right? Yahweh knows who they are. But the bottom line is whether there's evil intent or whether it's just ignorance that leads to this counterfeit thing. Right? Yeah, that's a great point, right? So Parker says there's an indication that Judas Iscariot was not fully aware of the impact of what he did until after the deed was done. Satan may have convinced him he was doing the right thing, and he may not have realized it would result in Yahshua's death. It is Satan's way to withhold a significant portion of the truth. That is spot on. Thank you for that, Parkus. That's exactly right. He thought he was doing the right thing, and yet he was playing right into the hands of the adversary in his plan. So this is the way these things happen. And on a grand scale, when you get so many people together, what you get is what? You get the Tower of Babel. So what you see going on with the Great Reset as we go through it, when you look at that, see it for what it is in terms of nothing new in history, right? There's nothing new under the sun. So go back to Genesis 11 and go look and see what was happening at the Tower of Babel and how people were trying to touch the sky and they were trying to make a name for themselves, but without Yahweh, you see. So let's keep all that in mind. All right, let's go into this article and we'll take it from there. All right, so what is the Great Reset? Michael Rectenwald. The following is adapted from a talk delivered at Hillsdale College on November 7th, 2021, during a Center for Constructive Alternatives conference on the Great Reset. Is the Great Reset a conspiracy theory imagining a vast left-wing plot to establish a totalitarian one-world government? No, notice that. Despite the fact that some people may have spun conspiracy theories based on it, with some reason, as we will see, the Great Reset is real. And this is what I'm saying, that people will take essentially conspiracy facts and they will construct conspiracy theories around it because it just looks so coincidental to be true, right? Okay. Indeed, just last year, Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, And by the way, Klaus Schwab, you're going to hear that name over and over again. He is indeed the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. He's the driving force behind all of this, okay? A famous organization, World Economic Forum, a famous organization made up of the world's political, economic, and cultural elites that meets annually in Davos, Switzerland, and Thierry Maleret, co-founder and main author of the Monthly Barometer. So these two, Klaus Schwab and Thierry Maleret, published a book called COVID-19, The Great Reset. In the book, they define the Great Reset as a means of addressing the weaknesses of capitalism that were purportedly exposed by the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to show you. That Great Reset book in a second. But here's another thing I want to say, and I said this at the beginning of my previous talk. And I'm going to say it again. My purpose here is not to quote unquote get political. Okay, so I just want to state that at the outset. However, it is impossible to talk about these things without talking about politics and about talking about liberalism and conservative, etc. So I don't apologize for that. It is what it is. In Yahshua's time, when he dealt with the Pharisees and he dealt with the Sadducees, I promise you that they were dealing with politics as well. Okay. So while I don't overtly talk about politics, I'm not going to tell you believe this or believe that, but I'm going to state as I see them, the facts, and then I'm going to let you make up your mind. Okay. So going to back to this article. So he says in the last year in this book, they defined the Great Reset as a means of addressing the weaknesses of capitalism that were purportedly exposed by the COVID pandemic. Okay. But this is a copy of the book here. So this is real. And let me go ahead and stop sharing. Okay, actually start sharing here. So these are actually 3 books that were written by Klaus Schwab. And this is the one that was written together with Thierry Maleret, COVID-19, The Great Reset. This was part 2, The Great Narrative for a Better Future. So in COVID-19, The Great Reset, this came out in 2020. This came out 2 months. And this is where you can see that why conspiracy theorists are going to do their thing, right? This came about 2 months before the COVID-19 crisis was identified in China, and about 5 months before the WHO declared it a worldwide pandemic. Okay, and then this book outlines what they see as being the issues raised by the COVID-19 pandemic and the opportunities. And I use that word deliberately because they use it around 17 times throughout the book. How the COVID-19 crisis creates an opportunity for the world to be reset, which is what the term Great Reset is referring to. Okay. And then, but they don't offer solutions in this book, at least not to a great extent. I have not read the whole thing, but I'm reading through it. I've been starting to read through it. And I intend, Yahweh willing, to read through the whole thing, but all 3 of these books, actually, because I want to know what they contain. I don't want to take someone else's word for it. Okay. So this one doesn't really present solutions. The Great Narrative, which is kind of the sequel to this, does present specific solutions. And in this book here, The Fourth Industrial Revolution, I think this actually, I don't remember if this one came out after or before these. This one is rather interesting because it talks about the major component to the Great Reset, which is with regard to technology and the future of humanity, and the whole idea of what we would call a technocracy. So I'll come back to all this in just a little bit. So please stay with me. I know that a lot of this is going to be kind of all over the place, but I'm trying to keep it as succinct and as understandable as possible. I know that when I look at this kind of stuff, I want someone to explain to me like I'm a 4-year-old, right? So, and by that, I don't mean to be condescending, but I just mean to explain things that it's not, going over our heads. So I'm going to try to do that as best I can here and give you the information as best I can give it. Okay. All right. So let's go back to the article. So 3rd paragraph, but the idea of the Great Reset goes back much further, and it does, because the WF started around 1971. It can be traced at least as far back as the inception of the WF, originally founded as the European Management Forum in 1971. In that same year, Schwab, an engineer and economist by training, published his first book, Modern Enterprise Management in Mechanical Engineering. It was in this book that Schwab first introduced the concept he would later call stakeholder capitalism. So remember I said before, two main concepts, the concept of public-private partnership and stakeholders, right? So what is a stakeholder? Let's talk about that for a second. So I live in the world of government. I've been a government employee in both state at both the state and federal levels for all my career, which is going on like 30 years now. Okay, stakeholder is the term stakeholder is it's used not just in government, it's used in government, private sector, but it's a lingo, right? It's the type of lingo that falls into what you talk about at meetings and all that. A stakeholder, because you have to have big words to describe everything. You can't just say, the people who stand to benefit, but that's what a stakeholder is. The stakeholder is the individual who or group that stands to benefit from the particular things that your organization or your agency does. So if I'm writing a report for one of my superiors and I'm told, consider all the different stakeholders for this report, I have to think, okay, so maybe there's a manager and maybe there's an assistant manager and maybe that's the people that they work with, the people in their office, right? Or if we're talking about clients, customers, we're talking about the general public. So the general public may be stakeholder, colleges and universities may be stakeholders, right? In other words, anyone who's going to be touched by the stuff that you do is a stakeholder. Why? Because they have a stake in what it is that you're doing. So therefore, they're stakeholders. But the concept of stakeholder capitalism is extremely important because it is central to what they are hoping to accomplish through the Great Reset. And if you're going to talk about this, you have to talk about basic economics and our economic system. So when I say our economic system, I'm talking mainly about the Western economic system as typified by the United States and other Western democracies, okay? Because there are many different government systems in the world, but the two major ones that you typically hear of that are of any consequence, quite frankly, are the concept of a free market enterprise system, which is what we refer to loosely as capitalism. And I'm not going to go too deeply into all this, but you all know the term. And then they have the system which is known as socialism, right? And again, I'm not going to go too deeply into any of this. Communism being like an ultra, if you're looking at a spectrum where on the right side you have capitalism, like pure capitalism, and you go to the left, pure socialism. Well, it doesn't really stop at socialism. It goes ultimately to communism, right? And socialism is right about here. But the bottom line, just to keep the matter simple, we're going to talk about capitalism, which essentially means that people have a right to things like, to own property, private property, and also there are markets. So you don't decide things, how things are priced based upon somebody's whim and fancy. The government doesn't say, this watch costs, $50 and therefore everyone has to pay $50. A market decides that. So you make the watch and then you see what, you advertise it, you market it, and then you see what the market for watches pays. And if the market settles on $20, then that's what you pay for this watch. If because of economic circumstances, at some point, materials are rare and it costs more to make the watch, maybe the watch 10 years from now goes up to $30. But the market's decided that. It's not some bureaucrat centralized in Washington that makes that decision. The market decides that. And you have markets for everything, for goods, for services, etc. With socialism, you have more of a system where the government has more say in what happens with those goods and services. Socialism is a system, of course, that was implemented in the Soviet Union, that's implemented to a great degree in China, even though that's a little bit of a mix, as we'll see in a bit, and places like Venezuela, right? And history has proven that socialistic systems do not work. And I have no problem saying that and not feeling political about that. And there are going to be people out there that will vehemently disagree with me, but you know what? The facts of history are on my side. Socialism does not work. People starve under socialism. Things don't get done under socialism, okay? Capitalism is not perfect, and I don't want to give the impression it is, but I have, again, the facts of history on my side. I could point to half a dozen books in my library that are not necessarily written from a conservative source, that will show you statistics that show how capitalism has lifted people out of poverty, more people out of poverty than any other system that has. Is it a perfect system? It is not, but it certainly is leaps and bounds over a socialist system. Okay, that's about as political as I'm going to get today. Now, we'll come back to that a little bit later. So stakeholder capitalism is important because in the capitalistic system, and I'm giving you all this as background to be able to better understand the article, it's important to understand that capitalism as a system relies on, and now I'm talking mainly about what happens in the United States as a representative of capitalism, is free markets, the free enterprise system. The way that it works typically is that people buy, and please understand, I'm highly simplifying this, but this is essentially how it works. People buy ownership into companies, right? Right now, you could do that. Corporations do that. Not government entities, but well, some government entities, private companies do that for other companies, etc. However, individuals also do that. So if you wanted to go right now and buy a few stocks of Netflix, when you go buy stocks, if you go on something like E-Trade or Ameritrade or whatever, you can actually buy stocks. And if you buy stocks, what you are doing is you are buying ownership of the company. You now are a part owner of that company, believe it or not. That's the way it works. So if you go and you buy 10 shares of Netflix, and you could do that, right? This, not this day, but during the week, you buy 10 shares of Netflix. You now are an owner of a share of Netflix because you have stock in their company. In other words, you've bought shares. The stock represents shares. You are now a shareholder of Netflix. If you want to go buy Disney, you go buy 10 shares of Disney. You are now a shareholder in Disney. So when you hear the term shareholder, that's what we're talking about. In the system that we have traditionally learned and all our lives, essentially, in terms of capitalism, what we have is maybe termed shareholder capitalism. In other words, the company, the corporation, whether it's Disney or Netflix or whomever, the company exists essentially to turn a profit for their shareholders. That's what they exist for. The company doesn't have a stake in your politics. It doesn't have a stake in your religion. Okay. It doesn't have a say in what you do in your personal life. That's not what you own it for. That's not what you own Disney for, or Netflix, or Apple, or Starbucks, or whatever it is that you've bought. You own that so that you can make money, period. It's an investment that you have done so that you can own a part of that company so that when they are profitable, you share in those profits. And that's how the system works. It is what is the word I'm looking for? It is I don't know what the exact word would be, but in other words, it's when you say amoral, you're not saying that it's moral one way or the other, or that's not moral or either or immoral. Amoral means it has no morality. It's completely neutral. So moral is not the word I'm looking for, but the ownership is whatever that word would be. You're not interested in doing it for religion or for history or for whatever. You're doing it because you are investing so that you can earn money on that, so that when you retire or whatever, you have money that you could sell some of those stocks, and hopefully you've made a profit, and now you can use that money for whatever it is, for retirement or whatever it is that you want. That's how shareholder capitalism works. With stakeholder capitalism, the story changes entirely, because what the idea behind stakeholder capitalism, which is not new, which goes back at least to the 1970s when this was occurring. And stakeholder capitalism is really the cornerstone of what the WEF and all those who are buying into the Great Reset are doing. It is an entirely different way of looking at capitalism. It's not even capitalism per se. It is, but it isn't. It's a hybrid. And what it is essentially is a capitalism that has two tiers. The tier at the top, which is government. Remember I talked about public-private partnership? The tier at the top is a public-private partnership, which is the corporations, the organizations, in tandem working with the government. That's the capitalist part of it, making money at the top. And then everyone else at the bottom, that's you, that's me. And that's a socialistic system that lives and breathes and exists at the behest of the top tier. In other words, whatever success the folks at the top have trickles down in whatever way they determine for the people at the bottom of the tier. more to come on that. Let's go back to the article. But I want you to have the general sense of what's happening there. Schwab first introduced the concept he would later call, oh, and let me just say this one other thing. So it's not shareholder capitalism, but stakeholder capitalism. So whereas under shareholder capitalism, the company exists to make a profit for the shareholder in a neutral way, stakeholder capitalism says no. Stakeholder capitalism says your primary responsibility is not just to the shareholder. Your responsibility is to every stakeholder who bears, who has something who is going to benefit or not from the things that you're doing, right? So stakeholder capitalism is everybody who your business is going to touch has a share in your company. So therefore, everything that you do has to think about not just your shareholders, but everyone else who touches it. If that means your community, if that means, the government, if that means, people in another country, and on it goes. Now, it's interesting because remember, we're talking about a counterfeit system. So when you look at that, you think to yourself, oh, wait, but that kind of makes sense, right? Because a company shouldn't just be doing things, for money. That's a value judgment that has nothing to do with the system. That's a value judgment. That's a political judgment. That's not what the company exists for. That is not, has never, and will never be the purpose of a corporation. When I invest in something, I don't expect that company to take care of me and my family. I take care of me and my family. All I expect for them to do is to concentrate on earning a profit, earning a return on the investment that my money allowed. And anything else beyond that is none of their business. But that's not how these people see it. With these folks, their business is anything and anyone with whom they come into contact. And that, my friends, is a scary proposition. Because if the company that you're dealing with believes in has the same set of values that you do, no problem, right? Everyone's happy. But what if they don't? What if they believe in things that are the antithesis of everything that you believe in? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. If the company believes, if their philosophy is that they have to do things a certain way because that's what's politically correct in our day, they're going to do it. And if you don't like it, tough. If you don't like it, don't be a stakeholder anymore, right? And it gets more nefarious than that. So we'll go into that a little bit more deeply. So going back to the article, it was in this book that Schwab first introduced the concept he would later call stakeholder capitalism. And now that I give you that foundation, I think we can go a little quicker here. Arguing that this was Schwab argued, that the management of a modern enterprise, a company, must serve not only shareholders, but all stakeholders to achieve long-term growth and prosperity. Well, who gave him that right to make that decision? Schwab and the WEF have promoted the idea of stakeholder capitalism ever since. They can take credit for the stakeholder and public-private partnership rhetoric, that's why I said those are the two main terms to pay attention to, and policies embraced by governments, corporations, non-governmental organizations, what we call NGOs, and international governance bodies worldwide. What are international governance bodies worldwide? International organizations that have governing power, like the UN, like the WHO, the World Health Organization. And if you think that those things don't make a difference to your life, think again. Because the World Health Organization was responsible for much of what eventually resulted in lockdowns and everything during the COVID-19 crisis, right? Or as they like to put it, the COVID-19 era, because they don't believe that it's a crisis, a one and done that goes away. They think we're going to be dealing with this for years and years. Anyway, and that's by design. The specific phrase Great Reset came into general circulation over a decade ago with the publication of a 2010 book, The Great Reset. It was called The Great Reset by American urban studies scholar Richard Florida. Written in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, we all remember that, Florida's book argued that the 2008 economic crash was the latest in a series of Great Resets, including the Long Depression of the 1870s and the Great Depression of the 1930s. We know at least about that one, which he defined as periods of paradigm shifting systemic innovation. Okay, so I want to linger here for just a second, which he defined, excuse me, as periods of paradigm shifting systemic innovation. What is a paradigm? A paradigm is the model. It's a way of doing things. What is systemic? It means it's the way you do things through an entire system. And innovation is doing things in a new way, right? So paradigm shifting systemic innovation is just a fancy way of saying that it resets the way that you do things in a particular area. So for example, if you've always had a way of using your financial system, a paradigm shifting systemic innovation would be revamping the entire financial system to do it a different way. If you have an educational system that you've always done things doing A, B, C, and D in order to get your children educated, a paradigm shifting systemic innovation would be, now we're going to turn it upside its head and we're going to do it completely differently. And now we're going to do it with C, D, E, and F rather than A, B, C, D. So what he's saying, what Richard Florida was saying is that, and back in 2008, was that there's a pattern in history. And that pattern is that when you have major world crises, it presents moments where entire systems can be changed, which is absolutely true. Because those are the moments at which, you know, people are either open, depending on how you look at it, either open or susceptible to, right, change. It's kind of like how I described it in the first part, where I said that if you are ministering to someone who has gone through a tragedy, you know, Jay Adams used to say that even though it's difficult and painful to do that, sometimes those are the best moments at which to minister to someone, because those are the moments at which people are ready to make a change, right? And he means that in the best and the most benign of ways. He doesn't mean it in a sense of manipulative. It's just that sometimes people's defenses are up so strongly that they don't want anything to do with religion. But when they go through a crisis, all of a sudden they remember why they're here, right? It's like there's precedent for that even in the scriptures. If you look at the book of Ecclesiastes, and I'm highly paraphrasing here, so don't quote me, but it says something to the effect of it's better to be in a house of mourning than it is to be at a party, right? Because in a house of mourning, it's the message is that in the house of mourning, if you're having a funeral for someone or a memorial service, you're thinking about your life and you're thinking about, okay, I need to get my life in order, as opposed to when you're partying and you're not thinking about anything except having fun, right? And that's kind of what's happening with this concept. It's, you know, the person is in a moment of where they're open because the defenses come down. Okay, so when you transition that over into the sense of the Great Reset, when you're talking about governments and you're talking about entire populations, when you have moments of crisis, whether it's a regional thing or a worldwide thing, those present moments where people's defenses are down and therefore they're more susceptible to change. That is why the beast that's described in the sacred scriptures is able to come in and wreak havoc, because what the beast does is come in and institute paradigm shifting systemic innovations, right? So when you look at the scriptures, what it doesn't say it in those exact words, but what's being described is that the beast comes into play at a time when there is worldwide crisis of some sort, like economic crisis or something, and the beast essentially comes in and says, I have the answers. And when they come in and say, I have the answers, who are people to disagree with them? They're in pain. They're going through all kinds of confusion, right? And when people are in confusion, they're going to accept help from wherever that help is coming. They're not going to think about the usual objections because they need help and they need it now. So when the beast comes in and says, I have the answers, even if it's not great in terms of their overall well-being, they're probably going to say yes, because, well, you have the answers. You know, think about 9/11, right? 9/11 was, in my view, 9/11 was a reset shifting moment. Because things, you know, all of you have lived through 9/11 for the most part, right? I think everybody here, you're all of age where you've lived through 9/11. You were little or you were grown up already. And you know how things change. It created a paradigm shifting innovation, systemic innovation in the way we travel, right? When I was a kid, we used to be able to go and bring a person to you, and many of you probably remember this. We were able to go and bring people to the front gate without a problem. To the moment where you're actually looking out the window, waiting for your loved one to get on the plane and go, and you can wave bye-bye to them from the window. Try to do that today, right? And a whole other, some of you have never lived in a time because you were too little. You've never lived in a time when that was possible. For you, all you've ever seen is checkpoints and TSA, and you've gone to Washington and you've seen barriers in front of the White House and in front of Congress. Now, when I was a kid, you can go up, walk up in Congress, walk up the steps, and no problem. And not anymore. But why did people accept all that? Why do people accept the little 3-ounce things at the airport and everything else, and the shoes and the scanners and everything else? Because the alternative is horrific, right? And because the powers that be, whether for, and we're not going to debate this, but whether for good or for ill, we all have our opinions about it. But they have put so much fear, done so much fear mongering, okay, that for the average person, the scenario to contemplate not putting all those measures in place makes it okay, maybe not totally acceptable, but okay, it's just kind of a necessary evil, so we accept it. That's what I'm talking about, right? And we've had many moments in history where that has been possible, and with COVID, it's happened as well. With COVID, the kind of things that were spoken to us by government and even by corporations later, right, when the vaccines started to come out, they said things. It was a lot of fear mongering. It was a lot of, right, and oh, follow the science. But when you look at the actual science and you look in hindsight at the science, it wasn't the science, okay? And we can debate that. If we want to have that debate, we can have that debate. But I'm sorry, 3 or 4 booster shots in the course of 15 months is just a bit much for anyone to suspend disbelief, okay? And it doesn't work anyway because people still get sick. And on and on we can go. And then they told us masks, well, wear the mask, don't wear the mask because you only, we need them for healthcare workers and they don't work anyway. And then less than 2 months later, oh, everybody wear masks. And a few months later, you know what? Double masks are probably even better. That one went away pretty quickly, and on, right? And all of a sudden it was, yes, no, follow the sign. And it's always, and then if you don't do it, you're a conspiracy theorist or you're a rebel or whatever, and on and on. Okay, so this is how things happen. The populace accepts things because there's a public health threat, supposedly, right? There's all the fear mongering done and everything else. And of course, there's elements of truth in all of that, right? So I don't want to pretend that there was no danger. Surely there was danger and people have died en masse, okay? But can you excuse everything that has been done? And can you justify everything that has been done? It's up for debate. But the point is that people were conditioned to be able to accept those kind of things. Why? Because crises do that. And you're going to turn to the people that you trust, at least you're trying to trust. You got to trust somebody. So who are you going to go to? You're going to go to the governments. You're going to go to the scientists. You're going to go to the business people who are leaders in business. In other words, all the people who have power and influence and money and can make those kinds of decisions. So this is what he's talking about. Paradigm shifting ways of doing things. 4 years after Florida's book was published, at the 2014 annual meeting, so this is now 8 years ago, of the WEF, Schwab declared, what we want to do in Davos this year, Davos, Switzerland, is to push the reset button. And subsequently, the image of a reset button would appear on the WEF's website, and you can see that right now. In 2018 and 2019, here's where it starts to get really interesting. The WEF organized 2 events that became the primary inspiration for the current Great Reset project, and also, for obvious reasons, fresh fodder for conspiracy theorists. Okay. In May 2018, the WEF collaborated with the Johns Hopkins Center. That's Johns Hopkins University in the health center in Baltimore, Maryland, and very famous worldwide. And interestingly enough, a quick aside, Johns Hopkins became especially prominent because of the Spanish flu, right? The so-called Spanish flu, the 1918 to 20 pandemic, flu pandemic. That's where modern medicine came into total fruition, right around that time. And it was through Johns Hopkins where a lot of that happened. Anyway, so it's just kind of ironic. For health security to conduct, so they collaborated with Johns Hopkins, WF, to conduct Clade X, a simulation of a national pandemic response. Interesting. That's May 2018. Specifically, the exercise simulated the outbreak of a novel strain of a human para-influenza virus with genetic elements of the Nipah virus called Clade X. The simulation ended with a news report stating that in the face of Clade X, without effective vaccines Experts tell us that we could eventually see 30 to 40 million deaths in the US and more than 900 million around the world. Now, remember, this is just an exercise that they did. It wasn't real, obviously. 12% of the global population. Clearly, preparation for a global pandemic was in order. By the way, when you look at the book of Revelation and you see situations where a third of the population dies, whatever, in my opinion, this is a way that it could happen to pandemics, right? In October 2019, the WEF, so this is a year later, there's a second exercise. The WEF collaborated with Johns Hopkins and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And by the way, Bill and Melinda Gates have been dealing for years with virus and vaccination thing. That's where they put a lot of their philanthropy on another pandemic exercise. This one was called Event 201, which simulated, get this, an international response to the outbreak of a novel coronavirus. Remember, this is an exercise. This was 2 months before the COVID outbreak in China became news and 5 months before the World Health Organization declared it a pandemic. And it closely resembled the future COVID scenario, including incorporating the idea of asymptomatic spread. So you can see why conspiracy theorists look at this and they say, is this too coincidental to be true? But let's lay that aside. The CLADEX and Event 201 simulations anticipated almost every eventuality of the actual COVID crisis. That's fascinating. Most notably, the responses by governments, health agencies, the media, tech companies, and elements of the public. The responses and their effects included worldwide lockdowns, the collapse of businesses and industries, the adoption of biometric surveillance technologies, and emphasis on social media censorship to combat misinformation, the flooding of social and legacy media with authoritative sources, widespread riots, and mass unemployment. All of this was encapsulated in the exercise. And all of this is exactly what wound up happening in the real world. In addition to being promoted as a response to COVID, the Great Reset is promoted as a response to climate change. I want you to note that also very, very importantly, okay? Climate change, COVID has been viewed, the COVID-19 crisis has been viewed as an opportunity. And you see that in throughout this book, where it talks about COVID being an opportunity for a reset. In other words, let's use this opportunity. Rahm Emanuel, who was Clinton's chief of staff, I think it was his chief of staff. He later became mayor of Chicago. He famously said, never waste a crisis, or it was something similar to that. I'm paraphrasing, right? Well, and that's not unique to him. Other people have said that too, but he kind of made it famous out there, right? Never waste a crisis. Why? Because those are the moments at which you can have these paradigm shifts and people will be susceptible to them and they will be accepting of them. So COVID-19, throughout this book, they refer to it as an opportunity to reset the world economy. What did they do with COVID? They had major lockdowns, which resulted in millions of businesses going out of business. Millions. Okay. All coincidence? You have to be the judge. If you're going to use it, they're saying in this book, this is a time for us to do this thing. And who has the power to shape policy and everything else? It's governments, to an extent, it's corporations, right? But more so the governments, and on and on. More of that in a little bit. But COVID presented an opportunity, but another thing that's going to be used as a means to the Great Reset is the whole concept of climate change. I don't have time to go through, even remotely, to go through all of the hullabaloo about climate change. Okay, they've been speaking about climate change since I was a kid. Only when I was a kid, it wasn't about global warming. And this is something many of you may not know. It wasn't about global, it was about global cooling. And all of a sudden, over the course of time, the data and the facts, this is what people never talk about. The data and the facts all of a sudden started showing, the actual data coming out showed that there was a warming trend and not a cooling trend. So whereas all the things that were done in the past, we're talking about freeze and, and nuclear winters and, and everything turning glacial and everything else. And we have to do all kinds of things to prevent us from becoming a frozen wasteland. All of a sudden now the data is not showing that. So now we switch over to global warming. So everyone remember what they don't talk about global warming anymore. What do they talk about? We talk about climate change. Why? Because once again, much of the data does not support the global warming narrative. So at some point, somebody got smart. They said, you know what? Let's just call it climate change, because now it's neutral. Now you can go any way that you want. Okay, so let's have that discussion one day about so-called climate change. Are there things happening in the world where should we be good stewards of the things around us? Of course we should. Should we reduce carbon emissions and do, there's always an element of truth baked into these things. But the kind of projections that people make out there routinely, the kind of doomsday scenarios, etc. First of all, Yahweh will not allow human beings to destroy his good earth. That's number one. Okay, that's number one. But even if you're not going to believe that from religious point of view, the data simply does not support what people are, all these doomsday predictions. But that's a discussion for another day. But climate change, again, it's fear mongering at its highest. And it's going to be used to drive this narrative that is going to put us at the point where anything and everything can be accepted to go in a certain direction with regard to the things that they want to accomplish with the Great Reset. So climate change is going to be a major part of pushing that narrative forward. So let's continue here. So in addition to being promoted as a response to COVID, the Great Reset is promoted as a response to climate change. In 2017, I just don't know why it doesn't come out. The WEF published a paper entitled, "We Need to Reset the Global Operating System to Achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals." On June 13th, 2019, the WEF signed a memorandum of understanding with the United Nations to form a partnership to advance the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Shortly after that, the WEF published the United States World Economic Forum Strategic Partnership Framework for the 2030 Agenda, promising to help finance the UN's climate change agenda and committing the WEF to help the UN meet, quote, meet the needs of the fourth industrial revolution. Note the language. Remember the book I showed you before on the fourth industrial revolution? We'll come back to that later. To meet the needs of the fourth industrial revolution, including providing assets and expertise for digital governance. What is digital governance? It's governance done through electronic media and social media and big tech and things like that, okay? So what is all this about sustainability development goals? Well, again, it's using world systems to promote this concept of the need to reshape the world economic system. So let me show you one of the many things I'm going to show you here. Let me show you the UN. Can you see that coming through across the chat, across the thing? The 17 goals for people for planet. Put in the chat, please. Okay. So the Sustainable Development Goals are a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and improve the lives and prospects of everyone, everywhere. The 17 goals were adopted by all UN member states in 2015 as part of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which set out a 15-year plan to achieve the goals. So this is a UN-developed 17-goal plan for so-called sustainable development, which includes all these things, including dealing with climate action, right? So if you could see the goals here. Look at all these goals. And by the way, again, on the surface, all of this looks good. It looks benign. Who isn't against world poverty? Who isn't against hunger? Who isn't against climate disasters? Who isn't for affordable and clean energy and clean water and everything else? But when you look at this, you start to see the elements where political correctness and wokeness enter in to degrees that are over and beyond what the average person sees as necessary. And when you look at these things, you see that if their aim is to do these things by 2030, they're going to do anything and everything possible to shove those agendas down people's throats, no matter what. Even if you don't agree fundamentally with their assertions, like climate change. If you're a person who believes in stewardship of the planet, but you don't believe in the disaster scenarios that will force corporations and governments to implement policies that could be disastrous to our economy, then you have no say in the matter because you're an obstacle. You're getting in the way of progress, you see. Okay, let me show you.
I have never seen so many people so animated around.
Let me show you the actual goals. Oops, sorry, wrong one. And I don't want to spend too much time here because it's not really the main purpose, but this is the 2030 agenda. And by the way, 2030 is only it was 15 years away. Now it's 8 years away, right? So this is the timetable over which they want to do all this stuff. So here, what I'm saying, the WEF and the UN are collaborating. They have a framework of cooperation to make all these things happen. Coincidence that things are happening at a speed that's like dizzying in terms of the political climate and the cultural climate? It's just a little bit too much coincidence to me. Transform, and look at the language. This is the actual UN document, okay? And everyone hopefully sees that from the General Assembly back in 21st October 2015. It's a resolution adopted by the General Assembly and accepted. Transforming our world, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, okay? So remember I explained in the first session that this Great Reset is just the latest iteration. I'll come back to this. The latest iteration of what has been variously called over the years the New World Order, the International Economic Order, right? It's gone through many names, through different presidents and different UN configurations, and the Great Reset is the latest iteration of it, right? Except the difference is that now we're at a point in history where the world conditions are such, technology is such, crises are such in terms of their incidents or coincidence, right, are such that the alignment is becoming much more possible in our day as compared to when they talked about this as a new world order or whatever. It's an alignment of government, corporations, etc., where you are indeed transforming the world. You are turning the world. You are engaged in a Babylonish and a Tower of Babylon type exercise where you are trying to transform the world and essentially create your own version of utopia. In other words, you are trying to create a kingdom made in the image of mankind instead of made in the image of Elohim. And that's ultimately, from a spiritual perspective, what this is all about. Okay, it's about mankind using a secular way to create through the thinking of Babylon what Yahweh himself intends to create through his own system. And that's ultimately why it's doomed to fail. But even though it's doomed to fail, like every other attempt over the years, how much destruction is going to be left in its wake? That's my concern. How many economic systems and social systems and everything are you going to destroy in their wake? And how many people are going to have to die before it's all over? And that's the concern that I have. Although we know biblically where it all ends. Okay, so let's go back to the article. Actually, to the transforming our world. So if you look at this agenda is a plan of action for people, planet, and prosperity, right? We're going to bring in the kingdom. It also seeks to strengthen universal peace and larger freedom. We recognize that eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, including extreme poverty, is the greatest global challenge and an indispensable requirement for sustainable development. All countries and all stakeholders, note the language, acting in collaborative partnership, note the language, will implement this plan. We are resolved to free the human race from the tyranny of poverty and they're the Messiah, you see, and to heal and secure our planet. Man doesn't do that. Yahweh does that. Man acts as a collaborator with Yahweh to do that. We are determined to take the bold and transformative steps. They keep using that word transformative, transformation, which are urgently needed to shift the world onto a sustainable and resilient path. As we embark on this collective journey, we pledge that no one will be left behind. 17 sustainable development goals, and they list all the development goals they have. I mean, you can go read this document right now, and you can go through the entire thing, and it'll tell you these are the goals, right? End poverty and hunger, ensure healthy lives, but look what it also includes. Ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning. Okay, that's not the one I was looking for. 5, achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. Again, on the surface, it seems good, but we all know the political trends lately where you're now blurring the distinction. The way that you're going to achieve gender equality is by blurring the distinction between men and women, not just bringing equality to women and girls, but essentially pretending that there is no difference between men and women, right? Ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation. So there's climate things, environmental issues, right? And on. Sustainable economic growth, build resilient infrastructure, reduce inequality within and among countries. See, these are things that on the surface appear to be benign. But is there a more nefarious undercurrent? That's the problem. How do you reduce inequality within and among countries? How do you do that? Well, that's a stated goal of socialism. And the way that you do that essentially is by changing the system so that you take away from the people who are making money and you redistribute it to others through a different system like socialism. Okay, so I don't want you being fooled by this language of benign, reduce inequality. This is how things usually are put out there, right? Where they put things that in a benign thing, sustainable consumption and production patterns. There are agendas within each one of these elements that have details that are problematic in the way that they're implemented because of the political philosophies and the cultural and the social conditions that will make that possible. Let's go back to the article. So I'm going to close this. As I go through these, I'm going to close some of these. WEF. Okay. In addition, okay, so that's the sustainability goals. In June 2020, at its 50th annual meeting, this is just last year, in last summer, the WEF announced the Great Reset's official launch. And a month later, Schwab and Milleret published their book on COVID and the Great Reset. The book declared that COVID represents, and this is a direct quote from the book, an opportunity that can be seized, that, quote, we should take advantage of this unprecedented opportunity to reimagine our world. Reimagine our world. Yeah, 2020 was 2 years ago, correct. Not last year, 2 years ago. Thank you for that correction. That, quote, the moment must be seized to take advantage of this unique window of opportunity. This is all from the same book, by the way. And that quote, for those fortunate enough to find themselves in industries naturally resilient to the pandemic, think here of big tech companies like Apple, Google, Facebook, and Amazon, quote, the crisis was not only more bearable, but even a source of profitable opportunities at a time of distress for the majority. How about that? So major corporations had great opportunities to make money, in other words, right? Now, he doesn't say this with the intent of necessarily saying that, but it's like you can't help with the stuff that's dripping from your mouth. You don't even realize what it is that you're saying and the translation that's coming across to people. So although he didn't mean it like this, no doubt, but the way we look at something like this, he's saying in essence that companies profited and made all kinds of money while everyone else was in distress, in economic distress and losing jobs and everything else. And then we know the details because we know how they made money, right? The figure came out the other day, and I don't want to make too much of an issue of this, but I have to mention it, okay? Pfizer's profit. Pfizer is one of the companies that creates the vaccine. In 2021, you want to know what Pfizer's profits were? While millions of businesses were losing their money, Pfizer reported a 92% operational growth in revenue to $81.3 billion for the full year 2021, compared with 41.7 billion for the full year 2020. Okay, and that's just Pfizer. 83 billion. While other companies were struggling or going out of existence, and I don't know how we could go. Don't tell me. By the way, I was just speaking about this with someone the other day. How many viruses and vaccinations do you know of, or diseases that you know of, that require 3, 4, possibly 5 boosters in the course of less than 2 years? And yet this thing, they keep pushing booster after booster after booster, which, by the way, doesn't seem to work anyway because people are still getting sick left and right. So you tell me if there's not an agenda beyond this. And I'm not the one. I don't like to look at things simplistically and this is all about money or whatever. But sometimes the facts speak a lot louder than words. So we got to be careful about that. Okay, we got to be careful about that. So let's go back to the article. The Great Reset aims to usher in a bewildering economic amalgam. Schwab's stakeholder capitalism, here it is again, which I have called, this is Michael Rectenwald, corporate socialism, and Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben has called communist capitalism. Now, hear this carefully. And here's starts to get a little bit more complicated, but don't be thrown. In brief, stakeholder capitalism involves the behavior modification of corporations to benefit not stakeholders, shareholders. That's you and me, people who own the company, but stakeholders, individuals and groups that stand to benefit or lose from corporate behavior. Stakeholder capitalism requires not only corporate responses to pandemics and ecological issues such as climate change, which are the two main drivers of the Great Reset, but also rethinking corporations, and this is a direct quote from the book, rethinking corporations' commitments to already vulnerable communities within their ecosystems. This is the quote, social justice, end quote, aspect of the Great Reset. So if it surprises any of us at the degree to which in the last few years there's been all this emphasis on so-called social justice in all its various ramifications, and I'm not going to go into the specifics because we all have been experiencing it, and I don't want to get ultra political here, okay? But the whole concept of social justice, to the degree in which it's being pushed, it has been pushed, and to which it is being pushed, is something that is beyond the pale. And is directly related to this. Stakeholder capitalism requires not only corporate responses to pandemics and ecological issues such as climate change, but also rethinking corporations' commitments to already vulnerable communities within their ecosystems. Again, when I invest in a company, I'm not interested in their view on abortion. I'm not interested in their view on racism. I'm not interested in their view. I don't want them to be racist, right? I don't want them to do things that are unethical or to pollute the environment or any of those things. But there are presumably systems in place to take care of those things. There are, government oversight agencies. There are internal agencies within their own organizations that are supposed to be dealing with that. Discrimination laws, and on we can go. Supposedly, all these systems that are in place, I don't need the corporation itself looking out for my public welfare, for my social welfare. That's not their job. I didn't invest in the company for them to do that. But yet that's exactly what they're doing under the system. And now you're going to find out why. This is the social justice aspect of the Great Reset. To comply with that, governments, banks, and asset managers use the environmental, social, and governance, or ESG index, to squeeze non-woke corporations and businesses out of the market. Now, I should not assume that everyone understands what it means, woke. Woke is just a slang term that's used to say that you are politically correct. We used to call it political correctness, right? Nowadays, woke, as if you woke to whatever you had to wake up to, right? You're woke. That's the term that's used to be politically correct. So the ESG scores are used in order to squeeze non-woke corporations and businesses out of the market. What is the ESG score? Well, first of all, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance, right? The ESG index is essentially a social credit score that is used to drive ownership and control of production away from the non-woke, in other words, people who don't buy into all the wokeness, or the non-compliant, people who don't get with the program, right? So this is an incredibly important concept that we have to do a closer look into, right? So this is from Investopedia. This is just a website that is geared towards investors. There's no agenda attached to this. There's no political agenda. This is Investopedia. And by the way, you can go to the ESG website, right? What is a social credit score? A social credit score is something that is used to how shall I say, to measure your degree or to evaluate your degree of being with social program, right? I don't know if you ever saw. It's not a series I would necessarily recommend to everyone because it's some of the episodes are just kind of way off the bat and I stopped. But it was there's a program out there on Netflix called Black Mirror, and it's like a series of, it's almost like a Twilight Zone type thing where they show you some vignettes and they give you some stories, and they're usually very dark in their nature. One of them was about social credit scores. So it's like, when you go to something like Yelp and you have stars, like a star system, or you go to Travelocity and you give a rating of 4 stars, and you think about things like cleanliness, and have you ever looked, when you're looking for a hotel, and look what they say about cleanliness and safety and staff and breakfast and whatever, right? And you give them a score. That's a social credit score. When you apply it to individuals, it gets downright creepy, right? But it's becoming more and more possible to give people evaluations, social credit evaluations, right? We kind of do that already with likes on social media, with likes on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever, that's a very mild version of a social credit score. And this is why people, if they don't get enough likes, they feel slighted, right? Because, oh, you're not liking what I say. Well, this takes it to another level. Before I go to this ESG criteria, I want to show you an article of how social credit scores have actually been used since around 2014. Can everyone see this Business Insider article on China's social credit system? And pay close attention to this, because the system that you're seeing the WEF implement for the Great Reset is directly related to what China is doing, okay? China's social credit system ranks citizens. Look at the date on this, December 2021, but it's going to show you that they've been up to this since 2014. See that? Okay. China's social credit system ranks citizens and punishes them with throttled internet speeds and flight bans if the Communist Party deems them untrustworthy. China has been rolling out a system that ranks its citizens based on their social credit. This is Business Insider. By the way, this is not even a conservative source. This is a liberal source, quite frankly. It's not a unified nationwide system, but China plans on eventually making it mandatory for everyone. Let me read a little bit of this article. I won't do the whole thing. The Chinese Communist Party has been constructing a moral ranking system for years. Listen to the impact of that. A moral ranking system for years that will monitor the behavior of its enormous population and rank them all based on their social credit. The social credit system, first announced in 2014, is an important component part of the socialist market economy system. Notice that, an important component part of the socialist market economy system. Remember, I said that there are two tiers to the system that's being implemented with the Great East Reset, which is what they want to do worldwide. They want to implement a system where the top tier, which is government and corporations working in public-private partnership, are making money and making those people at the top rich, while everyone else is engaged in a socialist market economy system, which is remember I said before that they're going to equalize the playing field. Remember the sustainable goals, removing inequality within and outside and between nations. This is how they do it. This is all played into how they do it. Let's go back. And the social governance system, what did I do? And aims to reinforce the idea that keeping trust is glorious and breaking trust is disgraceful, according to a 2015 government document. The rankings are decided by China's economics planning team, the National Development and Reform Commission, the People's Bank of China, and the Chinese court system. And notice the partnership between government, banks, right, in China. According to the South China Morning Post, the system can be used for individual people, but also for companies and government organizations. The private sector, including the burgeoning tech world in China, has their own non-governmental scoring systems that they implement, as Wired reported. For example, Sesame Credit, which is owned by Jack Ma's Ant Group, uses its own unofficial scoring system for its employees, such as studying shopping habits, according to the think tank Merix. The program has been piloted for millions across the country in recent years, as CNBC reported, and was expected to become fully operational and integrated by 2020. But at the moment, the system is piecemeal and voluntary, though the plan is for it to eventually be mandatory and unified across the nation, with each person given their own unique code to measure their social credit score in real time per Wired. Let me just give you a little bit more. Bad driving and debt could get you downgraded in the social ranking system. So in this Black Mirror episode, people had, on their smartphones, the ability to see where their social credit score was. And you had a star system. So you had to be on your best behavior. Like, the main protagonist of that episode, she wanted to get a better high-class apartment, but you had to have a social credit score of like 4. And I think hers was like 3.7. So she was trying to find ways to bump up her score, or she couldn't even be considered for the higher level thing. Like private credit scores, a person's social score can move up or down depending on their behavior. The exact methodology is a secret. There's a surprise. But examples of infractions, the government looking to see if you're committing moral infractions include bad driving, smoking in non-smoking zones, buying too many video games, and posting fake news online, specifically about terrorist attacks or airport security. Other potential punishable offenses, including spending too long playing video games, wasting money on frivolous purchases, and posting on social media. Oh, this is China. This could never happen in a country like the United States that values freedom. No, you're right. You can only be prevented from going someplace because you don't have your vaccine passport to show. Like when I went to New York City, I couldn't even get in to have a sandwich without my ID and my driver's license and my vaccine card. Okay. It can never happen here. Okay. Or it can never happen, you want to go and you want to and you want to work, right? Now let's ask a couple of the people here who no longer have a job because they refuse to get the vaccine, right? Yeah, it can happen. Let's keep reading. China has already started punishing people by restricting their travel, including banning them from flights. Oh, you mean like shutting down travel and lockdowns? Authorities banned people from purchasing flights 17.5 million times by the end of 2018, according to the National Public Credit Information Center. Think about that, the National Public Credit Information Center. I have a problem just with that. They can also clamp down on luxury options. Many are barred from getting business class train tickets, and some are kept out of the best hotels. The eventual system will punish bad passengers specifically. Potential misdeeds include trying to ride with no ticket, loitering in front of boarding gates, or smoking in non-smoking areas, and on and on. And the article just goes on and on. And you could find this right now. This just came out in 2021. Okay. All right. Let me get rid of this article for now. And let me go now back to the ESG. Okay, so knowing that now, environmental, social, and governance criteria are a set of standards for a company's operations and that socially conscious investors use to screen potential investments. Environmental criteria consider how a company performs as a steward of nature. Now we're talking about companies, not individuals. Social criteria examine how it manages relationships. By the way, do you see this article on environmental, social, and governance criteria? How it manages relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, and the communities, in other words, stakeholders, right? Where it operates. What are they doing with employees? What are they doing with suppliers? What are they doing with customers? What are they doing with communities? Governance deals with a company's leadership, executive pay. Are they paying people enough, right? Audits, internal controls, and shareholder rights, okay? So here are the key takeaways. Environmental, social, and governance, ESG, I'm just gonna keep saying ESG now, criteria are an increasingly popular way for investors to evaluate companies in which they might want to invest. Many mutual funds, brokerage firms, and robo-advisors now offer products that employ ESG criteria right now, and have been for a long time now. ESG criteria can also, why does that matter? Who cares, right? Nobody even knows about this stuff. Who cares? Who cares? Well, we'll find out why we need to care. ESG criteria can also help investors avoid companies that might pose a greater financial risk due to their environmental or other practices. How ESG works. Investors have in recent years shown interest in putting their money where their values are. Putting their money where their values are. As a result, brokerage firms and mutual fund companies have started offering exchange-traded funds, that's like when you go on E-Trade and do a trade, and other financial products that follow ESG criteria. So in other words, if you want to find a company that has a high ESG score because you care, you can research that company. Among other things about whether they turn a profit and everything else, you can look at their charts, their financial charts, and you can also look at their ESG score. And if they don't have a high enough ESG score, you can decide not to invest in that company. But most investors, in my opinion, don't even know about this, much less care about it. But the big corporations do. And the asset managers who manage the corporation's funds, like their retirement accounts, they do. You don't have to understand every single thing I'm talking about, because even I don't understand all the details. But I know that asset managers like BlackRock or Vanguard, people who sell index mutual funds and things of that nature, okay? They're the ones who hold the money for many of these companies, and they are the ones who are calling the shots based upon the company's ESG criteria. And that's where we're getting into trouble. Let's keep reading here. So according to the most recent reports from the Center Foundation, investors held $17.1 trillion in assets chosen, that's 12 zeros, chosen, I think 12 zeros, chosen according to ESG criteria at the beginning of 2020, up from 12 trillion just 2 years earlier. Okay, so these are the three types: environmental, social, governance. What do they measure? Environmental criteria may include a company's energy use, waste, pollution, natural resource conservation, and treatment of animals. The criteria can also help evaluate any environmental risks a company might face and how the company is managing those risks. For example, there might be issues related to its ownership of contaminated land, its disposal of hazardous waste, its management of toxic emissions, or its compliance with government environmental regulations. All good things, right? In other words, who wants to invest in a company that's polluting the environment and everything else, or treating animals badly, or doing unsustainable fishing or whatever? But again, who starts drawing the line with this stuff? What if all of a sudden the company starts, the criteria that they're measuring is how well the company deals with climate change, but they have to follow ridiculously restrictive policies that are not backed by science just because the political climate says that they should. And now you have to, instead of looking out for your shareholders' interests and making profit for them, now you're losing millions upon millions of dollars trying to implement policies for some environmentally conscious government that doesn't have a basis in science. Would you invest in a company like that if you didn't believe in that as your value? Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. The company is being judged by it. Social. Here's where it starts to get really fun. Social criteria look at the company's business relationships. Does it work with suppliers that hold the same values? It's all about values. Notice that, as it claims to hold. Does the company donate a percentage of its profits to the local community or encourage employees to perform volunteer work there? Do the company's working conditions show high regard for its employees' health and safety? Are other stakeholders' interests taken into account? Okay, so they're being very nice here. Are other stakeholders' interests taken into account? So what if your stakeholders are LGBTQ employees? What if you don't agree with LGBTQ values? What about if your stakeholders' interests include transgender clients and gender neutral types of things where people are being forced to do certain things, like use male and female bathrooms interchangeably and things of that nature? Is that part of the stakeholders' interest that you have to take into account? You bet it is. And on we could go. Governance. About governance, investors may want to know that a company uses accurate and transparent accounting methods, and the stockholders are allowed to vote on important issues. They may also want assurances that companies avoid conflicts of interest and blah, 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 right? So that's about how they treat their employees and the salaries, etc. Let me see if they give you a couple of examples here. So here are examples. Things that Trillium, this is a company, seeks out or considers positive ESG criteria include, now we bring it to the real world, environment. Companies that put out carbon or sustainability reports, limits harmful pollutants and chemicals, seeks to lower greenhouse gas emissions. How about if you're bringing a company to the brink of bankruptcy by following greenhouse gas emission laws that are not consistent with science? Uses renewable energy sources. So how about if you're forcing a company to start looking towards solar and wind, but you have to give up nuclear power, which, by the way, the facts show that nuclear power is a much more economical and efficient way of production than wind and solar. Proven, fact, numbers that I could pull out right now and show you. But if you don't agree with nuclear power, well, your score for environment is way down, right? See, this is politically oriented. So essentially, companies who are pushing this are trying to do through a social system what governments are not allowed to do. And guess what? You don't have a vote for it, because if a government tries to force you to follow certain policies, you go to the ballot box, at least for the time being, you go to the ballot box and you vote for someone else. What do you do if corporations do it? Corporations aren't accountable to you. Very interesting. So now let's go back to public-private partnership. So if governments and corporations are working together using systems like this, essentially corporations become an extension of government. You see that? So if the government can't do it, they can't do it through the front door. So now you do it through a back door. You just start pushing policies that other people don't agree with. You start pushing them through the back door, through the company, through the corporation. So the corporations, in effect, become an arm of government, something which you've never really seen. En masse anyway. I'm sure that you've had isolated incidents, but en masse you've never seen it because people will be outraged. Here, social stuff. Companies that operate an ethical supply chain, whatever ethical means to them, not to you, to them, the company, supports LGBTQ rights and encourages diversity, has policies to protect against sexual misconduct, pays fair wages, whatever fair means. Governance, companies that embrace diversity on their board. So in other words, if you don't have enough of, enough Hispanics or enough African American or enough Asian or whatever it may be, or enough, homosexual people on your board, your ESG score goes down. Embraces corporate transparency, employs a CEO independent of the board chair, and on and on. My friends, this is an independent Investopedia article. This is not a conservative publication, okay? All right, let me go now to, and I want to shift gears a little bit. I'm not going to finish this by 7:15, friends. So I'm going to have to poll you to see if you want me to go into a third session on this next week, or if you want me to just go a little bit longer today or what. But this is too important to try to cram through and not go through. Okay, so let me go. I'm going to switch over now. And now this source, I will tell you, is the Daily Wire. Okay, for those of you who don't know the Daily Wire is a very conservative source. Okay, but all this information is verifiable. Okay, and the article here is called "How 3 Investment Firms Are Turning Companies Like Disney Woke and What You Can Do to Fight Back." Okay, I'm going to read this by a person named Megan Basham. She's a journalist, and it says, "Perhaps no political shift in recent years has had as significant an impact on our culture as major corporations wading into political activism. PayPal, Nike, and like I said, all of this is verifiable. PayPal, Nike, and General Electric opposed a North Carolina law that required use of government bathrooms to correspond with biological sex. Many of you may remember this. This was a few years ago. Eventually, the financial pressure grew so great, the state's legislature chose to repeal the regulation. Buoyed, and by the way, as I read this article, I'm asking you not so much to look at the politics of it. I'm asking you to look at the mechanics of it. The mechanics. How has this happened? Okay. Buoyed by that success, companies like Coca-Cola and Delta waded into public debates against the Georgia election bill, issuing statements to suggest that requiring voter identification and shortening the absentee ballot period were motivated by racism. That's the kind of stuff we're talking about, right? Is it true? Some people will say yes. Some people will say it has nothing to do with it, right? So we're not going to get into that debate. But the fact that the companies are involving themselves in these types of issues is concerning, because their job is to make a profit for their companies. Their job is not to engage in political activism. Look, I'm a government employee, and every year we have the Riot Act read to us with something called the Hatch Act, H-A-T-C-H, especially around election time. And the Hatch Act essentially forbids us from engaging in any kind of political activism. I can't even have, if I wanted to, I wouldn't want to anyway, but I can't even have a button endorsing a particular candidate on a bulletin board because I could be in violation of the Hatch Act. And yet these corporations are entering widely into these debates without their shareholders' knowledge in most cases. Then just last month, and this came out, when did this come out? I don't know the date on this one, but it was fairly recent because we all remember this in the news if you've been following the news. Then just last month, Disney prominently opposed a Florida law that bans public schools from discussing sexuality or gender identity. This just happened a few months ago with kids in kindergarten through 3rd grade. Disclosure, Daily Wire has announced plans for children's entertainment content. So Disney was opposing this Florida law. You remember they call it they called it inaccurately the Don't Say Gay bill, but that's what was happening. What these cases have in common is that in every single one, the public, that is the majority of these businesses' customers, stood on the opposite side of the issues. Several polls showed a plurality of Americans believed public bathroom use should correspond to biology. Most Georgians back the common sense measures in the state's newest election regulations. You may agree or disagree, it's not the point. And of course, voters, including Democrats, overwhelmingly support Florida's parental rights and education law. These are verifiable facts. The explanation for why companies are increasingly choosing to act against what would seem to be their own self-interest. Why would you do that? Why would you act against your own self-interest? Why would you do exactly what your customers do not want? In order to become soldiers in the left's culture war, often centers on activist employees. That's the excuse most of them say. Like with Disney, they say, oh, a group of employees wanted to walk out and whatever. And they say, well, that's the reason we did it. No, that's not the reason why you did it. You're not going to change your entire structure and your entire brand on the basis of a few employees. That's the excuse given, but that's not the reason. Certainly that is a factor. But finance experts say another much more pervasive issue is currently overlooked: the influence of major money managers and a growing trend in a specific and troubling approach to investing. Stakeholders versus shareholders. You understand what that means now. The top institutional shareholders at Disney, remember, shareholders include members of the public like you and me, but it also includes companies, asset managers, etc. The top institutional shareholders at Disney are a trio of asset managers that control, on average, a 20% stake in every Fortune 500 company in the United States. The Fortune 500 companies are the top 500 major companies in the United States. Collectively, BlackRock, that's one of them, State Street, two, and Vanguard manage over $21 trillion, a figure larger than the GDP of the GDP stands for gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is an economic term that refers to the cost of all goods and services produced by a country in a given year. The gross domestic product, everything you produce domestically in a given year in terms of growth of goods and services. In other words, your entire economy. So between BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, they manage over $21 trillion of other people's money, by the way. It's not their money. It's pension funds, it's individual shareholder money, right? A figure larger than the GDP of every country in the world, including the US in 2020. Ours is actually bigger now. And I wanted to show you that, ours is actually now, this is the US debt clock. Can everyone see the US debt clock? So if you look at this debt clock here, here's the United States gross domestic product, US GDP. It's now 23.6 trillion, right? But even so, 21 trillion is pretty impressive. Okay, so between those three companies, asset managers, they manage more money than almost the entire US gross domestic product, the cost of all goods and services. That's massive, massive. Okay, a figure larger than the GDP of every country in the world, okay, and China. These asset management firms are driven by an investment philosophy known as stakeholder capitalism, as opposed to the old model of shareholder capitalism that's centered on corporations striving to provide a good return for investors. Stakeholder capitalism claims everyone in the community has a stake in how a company's activities impact any number of issues, from climate change to minority salaries. Therefore, it argues, for the sake of a greater social good, corporations have a responsibility to get involved in political and social causes that may have nothing to do with their businesses, whether it benefits their shareholders or not. As Nathan Estruth, a former longtime Fortune 500 executive at Procter & Gamble, told me, quote, stakeholder capitalism really means whatever the left defines it on that particular day. So if you don't give money to, in this case, Black Lives Matter, then you are not being responsive to your stakeholders. Put anything you want in parentheses. If you don't give something to Planned Parenthood, if you don't give something to this organization that deals with green energy or whatever it may be, right? You are not being responsive to your stakeholders because you're not being socially conscious. Doesn't matter if you agree or disagree. If you're not doing it, you're not in compliance with ESG, environmental, social, and governance. If stakeholder capitalism is the end goal, the means to get there is an investing approach known as ESG, which is why I took a lot of time to give you that. It's a system rather like China's social credit scores, and you saw it, except it applies to businesses, not individuals. Asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street assign companies points based on their performance on three metrics: environment, social, and governance, ESG. While the G, governance, can be largely benign, centering on how executive power is distributed through an organization, the E and the S provide left-wing activists the opportunity they need to advance their agendas through corporate policy. Fund managers may choose, and here's the key, these guys are fund managers, the BlackRocks, State Street, and Vanguard. So if you look here at the top, back to Investopedia, the top investors in Disney, I wanted to verify that for myself. And here they are: Vanguard, BlackRock, and State Street. And by the way, remember, it's not just that they manage Disney's funds, they manage up to 20%, 1/5 of most of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States. That's a lot of influence, a lot of influence. Vanguard owns 137.8 million shares of Disney, but it deals with $6.2 trillion in global assets. BlackRock deals with 6.47 trillion. That's actually low. I know for a fact that BlackRock, now that may have been true when this article came out, BlackRock manages about $9 trillion, about 9 trillion. State Street at this time about 2.7. So when you added all this up, it goes to about 21%. It may be a little bit off because this is probably an older article. Okay, but notice, I just find it interesting that as you go on in this Investopedia article, it talks about diversity and inclusiveness of Disney, and undoubtedly it's looking at their ESG scores to come up with that. Okay, so I'll come back to the BlackRocks of the world in a minute. Let's go back to the article. So they're fund managers, $21 trillion worth. Fund managers may choose not to partner with a company if it doesn't have a high enough ESG score. That's a threat, right? So if you don't give in to what these fund managers think are the political causes of the day, you may not have your funds managed by them. So you, like the individual in China who is being punished for not getting with the program, whatever Chinese government says it is, right? You, as a business, may not be able to participate in the system because of your ESG score with the company, and the fund manager may not represent you, which could be problematic. So when I say looking at things like, and we'll come back to that, when I say looking at things like prophetic trends, this is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. So when we're talking about the beast system, right? And you're talking about something like Revelation 13, where it tells you about, the mark of the beast and not being able to buy or sell. Hear what I'm not saying, right? Because I always have to clarify these things in case the video, gets misinterpreted. I'm not saying that the ESG system is the beast system, right? I'm not saying that it's the mark of the beast, right? So let me say that very clearly, and you're all hearing me as witnesses. I'm not saying that, but is it going to be something like that? Probably, because it'll be some type of, in my opinion, people keep looking for, ridiculous marks on the forehead and actual, but they're taking that way too literally. The mark on the head and on the thing. I look at that more like the Shema, right? It's not the phylacteries that you're wrapping around your arms and your head. It's a metaphorical concept. It's what you do on your arms. It's your business, right? It's how you think. It's how you work and how you participate in community. So the idea is not some stupid mark that you literally have or some chip that you stop. This is when I say stop with the immature way of looking at things. It's not that. It's not some concoction of things that are injected into your body, everything like that. That's the pitchfork and the horns, right? Stop looking for that. Instead, look for this. A way to something much more subtle, a way to keep you from participating in the system. It'll be something, in my opinion, like this. Okay, let's go back. Right now, there are people who have not been able to do certain things in certain cities for months now. Why? Because they won't produce the little pass. Some people can't go to work right now because they won't produce the little vaccine pass, right? This is a microcosm of what this mark of the beast is going to be like. Those are the things that you need to be looking out for. Okay. And notice how we look at the Chinese thing and it says, well, right now it's voluntary. And I don't think it's so voluntary, but voluntary. But one day it's going to be mandatory. And you think it can't happen in the rest of the world? Think again. Environment, social, and governance. All right, blah, blah, blah. Fund managers may choose not to partner with the company if it doesn't have a high enough ESG score. One example investor and entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy offers is Goldman Sachs' insistence that it won't take a company public in the United States. Goldman Sachs is huge. It won't take a company public. That means you can't progress in your business unless you find someone else to take you public. And you don't think that if Goldman Sachs won't do it, that doesn't reflect poorly on the company? They're going to wonder, even if they don't fully understand that, oh, this is an ESG issue. If they're with the ESG program, they're not going to want you either. So it's Goldman Sachs' insistence that it won't take a company public in the US if its board isn't sufficiently diverse in regard to race, sexual orientation, and gender. I'm not making this stuff up, folks. That's what ESG is about, Ramaswamy says. And this is not about believing in, believing in fighting racism and fighting, and discrimination rights and for, sexual orientation. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do with someone's nonsense political agenda where if you don't do it with the way they say it, how they say it, you're penalized. Doing what government couldn't do, Ramaswamy says, through the front door, because there are laws. In essence, Sachs is forcing the race-based hiring mandate even voters in deep blue, meaning deeply democratic, California rejected in 2020. Quote, the voters of California, the most liberal state, said, that's an understatement, by the way, said no to legalize racial discrimination, end quote. But that's through the political process. What ESG does is say, forget the political process. Let's just get this done through the market, where people work, where they bank, where they invest. Notice this, if politics is going to stop and the Constitution is going to stop us and the checks and balances are going to stop us, then let's just do it through the market instead. That's really what this is all about. And investment manager and finance author Jerry Bowyer succinctly puts it, quote, ESG is a political philosophy pretending to be an investment philosophy. Because BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street manage the retirement funds of so many Americans, they're able to use their power to shape companies from the boardroom on down, to shape companies. And that is something they don't particularly try to hide, and they don't. During a 2017 conference hosted by the New York Times, for instance, BlackRock CEO, the head of BlackRock, Larry Fink, openly admitted, and he's all over the place doing this stuff in speeches, that his aim is to change behaviors in corporate America. Speaking about remember, BlackRock, which does about $9 trillion of business, speaking about making diversity quotas in management, and hiring a part of BlackRock's, speaking about making diversity quotas in management and hiring a part of BlackRock's ESG scoring, Fink said, quote, at BlackRock, we are forcing behaviors. Excuse me? Forcing behaviors. We added 4 more points in terms of diverse employment this year. He's proud of that. You have to force behavior. And if you don't force behavior, whether it's gender or race or any way you want to say the composition of your team, you're going to be impacted. Note very carefully this statement here. If you don't force behavior, whether it's gender or race or any way you want to say the composition of your team, you're going to be impacted. That's a nice way of saying, that's a nice way of threatening the companies. You're going to be impacted means that we're going to pull our support from you and you're not going to be able to invest with our asset team. That's a threat. It's a nice business way of saying, get with the program or else. In the stark show of its power last June, the asset manager combined forces with State Street and Vanguard to vote to place 3 environmental activists on ExxonMobil's 12-person board to push new climate policies, right? You want to see this? Let's take a look. There's a couple of things I pulled up on BlackRock. This is one that's recent, Larry Fink's annual letter, BlackRock CEO, and that's him on corporate America. All right. So we'll just watch a little bit of this. We won't watch the whole thing. Here we go.
Morning, a BlackRock CEO.
This is CNBC back in January 21.
Fink publishing his annual letter to CEOs often has a remarkable influence over the conversation in corporate America. And I wrote my latest New York Times Dealbook column about it. This year, Fink is calling on companies to disclose and, interestingly, report their paths towards a net zero carbon footprint. In an interview, I asked him how much leverage he thinks he has over corporate America with the $9 trillion under management.
I actually believe if they want to have the highest performing stock in their industry, I think what I'm requesting them is what I see from where our clients' money is going. So if they don't choose to do this, I think you're going to start seeing some of these companies having lower performing companies. And we're starting to see a big evidence, especially in 2020. In each industry, we're seeing a wider range between price earnings ratios of the best companies who are more focused on stakeholder capitalism.
Notice the language. Companies who are focused on stakeholder capitalism, okay? He's one of the biggest proponents of this whole great reset. Guys like him, he's not the only one, of course, okay? But notice also the implied threat in all this. If they don't do this stuff, they're gonna be underperforming companies. And the implication is, well, and it's gonna reflect in your ESG scores, and there are gonna be consequences to that, right? And by the way, this thing in 20%, 81% of ESG strategies outperform regular indexes. I've seen figures that's a lie, okay? ESG strategy performing companies are not doing better. They're not doing returns better than non-ESG corporations. They're not. He's lying. But anyway, no one's going to question on him, right? Because such a smart guy, right?
We're moving forward versus the other companies. In 2020, 81% of ESG strategies outperform regular indexes, which is telling me and reinforcing this concept that more money is moving there.
Hitting the road, not all 5G networks are created.
More money is moving there. It doesn't happen. Oh, magically, more money is moving there because they're doing ESG related stuff that's positive. More money, people are investing more there because, hey, they're ESG highest strategy score. So people are saying that no, the reason more money may be moving there is because you're strong arming them and you're blackmailing them to do it. Like you're blackmailing the Disneys of the world and others to go against their own brand. Okay, to promote these ridiculous agendas that other people don't believe in. Okay, but that's what they're going to do. And by the way, by ridiculous agendas, I don't mean that I necessarily disagree with all the different things people are trying to do. The ridiculous part is the ultra woke things that are being forced upon these companies and upon people who don't believe in that. Right? Let's have the discussions. Let's have the discussions about environment, climate, and everything else. But let's do it in a responsible way, not pushing an ultra left-wing agenda that everyone doesn't buy into just because you say we should buy into it and because you have the power and the influence to do it. Okay, let me continue that article here. Not article, but the thing.
Equal. T-Mobile covers more interstate highway miles with 5G than Verizon. T-Mobile has more 5G bars in more places than anyone. Another reason T-Mobile is the leader in 5G.
And what I'm trying to do is inform management and boards that if you're going to have a high-performing stock over a long period of time, you need to be doing this. And BlackRock is doing it doing this ourselves on behalf of our shareholders. We're doing this on behalf of our employees and our clients. And so,
okay, I wish we had time to go through it all, but but I got to move on to other things. So let me show you another one. The one specifically dealing with the one from 2017 that she's quoting in this article, right? So let me take you to that one.
But you now make a point of that's an investment criteria for you.
well, behaviors are going to have to change, and this is one thing we're asking companies. You have to force.
He's not asking companies, right? Notice the language. He's very well. And he didn't get to be a CEO, right? Over for nothing, right? He's not asking companies. He's strong arming companies.
Force behaviors, and at BlackRock we are forcing behaviors. 54% of the incoming class are women. We added 4 more points in terms of diverse employment this year. And what we are doing internally is if you don't achieve these levels of impact, your compensation could be impacted. Okay,
we're doing the same.
See, notice that that's a threat. That's a nice business way of threatening businesses. This language of impacted. Your thing is going to be impacted. Yeah. In other words, you're gonna lose money, and money will not go to you, and you will not have an opportunity to invest with us and everything. And it goes on and on, but I'll just leave it at that. All right. Let me go just a little bit longer here. Just stay with me for a minute. All right, I'm going to go back to the article of Megan. Voting on your behalf. It's crucial to remember that the money that BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street are employing to pressure companies to bend to their will isn't actually their money. It's shareholders' money. It is the money of the average investor with a 401k, Roth IRA, or pension fund who may very well disagree with the agenda these giant financial stewards are pushing with it. But whereas in elections, people know if and how they are voting, when it comes to ESG, the vast majority of people don't realize that investment managers are casting ballots on their behalf. They are using shareholder votes that force companies to enact policies against fossil fuels or for LGBT priorities, for example. Any shareholder who doesn't attend meetings to actively cast a vote automatically votes with management. And by the way, I can tell you, because I get notices about company votes and shareholder meetings and all that. And I think I went once to one of those meetings. So I'm as guilty as everyone else, because you don't realize the kind of power that you have. But now I'm going to think twice about it now that I know about this stuff. It's a very aristocratic system, says Bowyer, because essentially, because these people don't know about it and they're ignorant about it, they just let it go. So these people keep doing whatever they want without opposition. It's a very aristocratic system because essentially we've delegated something to the experts that gives them the power to shape our lives, and we don't even know we've delegated it. Recent months suggest the right is beginning to wake up to the danger. In just the last year, red states, meaning Republican states, have begun to pull state pension plans out of the big three firms because they push ESG. West Virginia, for example, pulled out of BlackRock in January. So did the Arkansas Teacher Retirement System funds. As reported in the Wall Street Journal on April 6, conservative legal groups are helping states rewrite their laws so that asset managers like BlackRock are required to put financial returns ahead of partisan social goals when it comes to public investments. Estruth, who ran as a Republican for lieutenant governor of Ohio in 2018, says the threat posed by this kind of corporatist rule stems not just from the fact that it's bad politics, but also bad finance. Here's what I was saying from before. ESG funds don't tend to perform as well as those based on more traditional funds. What's happening, he says, is BlackRock is driving down their return rate while advancing the woke agenda using red state public pension funds. And then he goes on and lies about it. Yet he's probably using some creative accounting to come up with those figures, but it's not the reality. Yet every financial expert the Daily Wire spoke with admitted that the right is just beginning to get organized to resist the ESG movement. Even now, as the big three investors seem to force companies like Disney and Target to adopt policies they don't like, conservatives' first instinct is to turn to boycotts, a form of pressure that isn't likely to have significant impact. Okay. Then essentially they say that the better way to do it is not through boycotts, but it's actually better, I'm not going to read the whole article, it's actually better to attend the shareholder meetings and then vote against their propositions or come up with new resolutions and force them to vote on resolutions that oppose some of these things. Otherwise, you have no say in the matter. So you have to show up so that you can do these things. A couple of other things from this article. Bowyer says the most important thing for any shareholder to do is to log into shareholder meetings and voice their opinion. Rather than boycott because you suspect the company gives money to Planned Parenthood, wouldn't it be better to support a ballot resolution that requires the company to disclose all the charities it's giving money to, et cetera? Okay. Then he talks here, high-level employees at Disney, speaking on the condition of anonymity, confirmed for the Daily Wire that not all the executives at the company are happy about the extreme LGBTQ activism the company has engaged in lately. They believe it is damaging the brand and are internally calling for CEO Bob Chapek to return to his better initial instincts to stay out of politics. They feel it might pull Disney out of the tailspin of negative PR it is in, thanks to leaked audios which revealed one executive producer admitting that she inserted her not at all secret gay agenda into the Disney children's show she worked on. You're seeing this more and more. You're seeing this more and more. So, I actually wanted to show you that clip because that's an important clip. So let me bring that up for you. Okay, this is something that was uncovered by a journalist by the name of Christopher Rufo. And this is the last thing I'll show you from this article here, and then I'll move on. So this is the actual clip. This is in a Zoom meeting, and I don't remember if it was a shareholder meeting or what it was. I think it was an internal Disney meeting, and this is what she openly admitted in the middle of this public meeting. I guess she felt a moment of inspiration, and she said, "This is what they're doing." It's not people's imagination.
Grew up watching, all of the classics. They have been a huge like informative part of my life. But at the same time, like I worked at small studios most of my career, and I'd heard, you hear whispers. Like I'd heard things like, oh, they won't let you show this at a Disney show. And I'm like, okay. So I was a little like sus when I started. But then my experience was bafflingly the opposite of what I had heard on my little pocket of like, proud family Disney TVA. The showrunners were super welcoming. Meredith Roberts and like our leadership over there has been so welcoming to like my like not at all secret gay agenda. And so like I feel like I felt like it was, I mean, like maybe it was that way in the past, but I guess like something must have happened in the last like they're turning it around, they're going hard. And then all that like momentum that I felt, like that sense of I don't have to be afraid to like, let's have these two characters kiss, let's in the background this, like I was just wherever I could, just basically adding queerness to like if you see anything queer in the show, I'm proud of them. But like I just was like, no one would stop me and no one was trying to stop me.
And this is the kind of thing that you're seeing. Now, let me make clear again, right? We can talk about the evils of discrimination against any group. That's one issue. But when you're talking about taking your agenda and forcing it on other people in the ways that you want to see it enforced, and doing it in a way that you're targeting children, okay, before the adults have had a chance to even decide how they want to deal with these issues and how they want to deal with the totality of the issues. Let's have those discussions as adults. But you're going to go and you're going to insert your agenda into the thing that is meant for children without us having that discussion. I have a problem with that. But that's the kind of thing that you're seeing, and that's the kind of thing that the Larry Finks of the world are advocating, so that you can, because they're going to go along with the program, and anyone who objects to that, anyone who shows any kind of, hey, wait, whoa, put on the brakes, let's have a discussion about this first, you're going to be shouted down. And this is just one example of many examples. Climate change, right? Same-sex marriage, gender neutrality, et cetera, and any other issue that you want to throw in there that's politically charged. So how do you deal with a system like that? But this is what the Great Reset is pushing. The Great Reset is going to use systems like ESG for corporations to do what governments cannot, to essentially force people into certain molds. And if you don't like it, you can lump it. And right now, it's a lot of things that are voluntary and that you can kind of just, show little opposition to. What happens when you can no longer show opposition to it? Because all of a sudden it becomes really taboo to do that, right? Right now, just looking at the issue with the vaccine, and remember, as people get acclimated and they become used to things, we're used to TSA anymore. We're used to all kinds of restrictions on travel. We're used to barriers in front of our memorial buildings and everything. It's become like second nature to us. What else is going to be required to become second nature to us? Because in a moment of crisis, whether manufactured or real, we were forced to comply with certain things. And then, of course, when the nature of power is such that once the crisis is over, you don't get it back, right? You don't go back. We haven't gone back to no lines at airports. We haven't gone back to barriers in front of the buildings and on and on. It's like when they go and they put a tax on you, very rarely will you ever see a tax taken away once it's accomplished its purpose, because that's not the nature of power, right? The nature of power is once you've given it, once you've granted it, then they want more. You give the mouse the cookie and then they want a glass of milk. That's how it works. And then if you go long enough, people don't even remember what it was like before. And this is what we're seeing here. And we're being conditioned more and more to give up liberties, more and more to accept hook, line, and sinker what's tossed at us in the name of public health, in the name of public safety, in the name of security, in the name of economic equality, and on we can go. So much more that I could say. I'm not even touching the surface, but I've already been, this is almost 2.5 hours. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop. I'm going to have to do one more week. It's just I gotta share the rest of this information. There's more to share. So I will stop.